So wanted to talk today about a in-hand manipulation skill. There's a few of them, and one of them is called translation. And all that means is picking something up with your fingers and being able to use those fingers to put it into your hand. So that's one way. As well as if I pull that item out of my hand and back to my fingertips. That's the other kind of translation. So into the palm, out of the palm, to the fingertips. So both of those are ways of translating objects. Translating with stabilization is when we put something into our hand, stabilize it, especially with these two fingers, pick up something else, put it into our hand, and so on. So the easiest is without stabilization, putting something into your palm. Then we have putting it into your palm with stabilization. Now where it gets pretty tricky is with stabilization and we're pulling it out of our palm. So this is where a lot of kids have a hard time, is isolating these fingers and doing something different with them to pull those out. So what I suggest for a lot of kids is to put their hand in the supinated position, which is turned over, so that they can use gravity to their advantage. So you can turn it over to pick it up, pinch, and put it in. A lot of times kids will try to pick it up like this with their hand pronated, which means palm facing towards the ground. And then they don't have the visual of where their fingers are, and gravity is kind of working against them, and they're more likely to drop it. So when I'm practicing with students, I remind them to put their hand palm up. On this, there's different sorts of items that can be easier or more difficult for your students depending on if their issues are dexterity or if they have really tiny hands. So it all kind of depends, but typically things like coins are what we think of as far as translation. So, and because these items are flat and smooth for the most part, these can be especially tricky. So, and what a lot of kids will try and do with items as well is scoot them all the way to the edge of a desk or table before picking them up. So that's also one of the things I like to practice. With something like a poof ball that's kind of more three-dimensional, they don't have as big of an issue. But with tinier items like pegs or really flat items like coins, they tend to try and cheat the system, but they don't even realize a lot of times that they're doing it. But once they're told, can you try and pick it up without scooting it, it becomes more challenging and they have to think about it. So picking it up with your fingers, I like to call it swirling it away into your hand, and then picking up the next one, swirling it away, and so on. So take a slotted container, a little piggy bank, those sorts of things, and have one hand holding the container so that their other hand's not trying to help, because this is what a lot of kids like to do. So have them hold the container so that this hand isn't tempted to help, and then work on either one without stabilization first, so just this idea of using their fingers to pull that coin to their fingertips. So without stabilization, because I only have to focus on one, is a good place to start. And then you can go to two, which means they're going to have to stabilize. So they have to focus on keeping these fingers down, and these fingers are working. Now, another thing that a lot of students will try and do is, because it's so hard to get it to their fingertips, they'll just get it out of their palm, kind of to the base of their fingers, like here, turn their hand over and drop, which is not the full process, and usually leads to them dropping some of the items in their hand, because if you only pull it up to here, your hand is kind of in an awkward position, and you're trying so hard to push this in that usually their other fingers will fly up and they'll lose what they're stabilizing in their palm. So there's a variety of ways of grading this activity to make it easier and harder. So the materials themselves is one way. If items are too big, like if I were to give somebody something like this and this and say, hey, can you translate those? Obviously for a kid, that's going to be really tricky. For me, it's not as hard because I have large hands. So kind of finding that medium between super tiny so that they can barely feel it, which is hard, or too big so that they can't handle it. Something in the middle. Poof balls are usually a pretty good way to start. Pieces of crumpled up paper, because again, there's a lot of surface area to pinch, and there's that feeling, that texture that they know that it's in their hand, and they're not kind of guessing as to where it's located. And then the amount of items. So again, focus just on one to begin with, so it's just translation into your palm, out to your fingertips, into your palm, out to your fingertips. And then you can start working on 2, and then out to your fingertips with stabilization, and being able to control that stabilization enough to turn that hand back over and put it into a box or piggy bank or something like that. Another way you could make it more challenging is to have them, once they're really good at their dominant hand, is to then see if they can do it with their non-dominant hand, which is not as vital of a skill because you might not be doing it very often, but again, it's a challenge. And although it's harder for me to do it with my left hand, I'm a little bit slower, I'm definitely still able to do it. So if I had a cast on this arm, if this hand was busy doing something else, I would still be able to use my left hand to translate items and put them into a container. So it's a good skill that's relatively cheap. You can use things that are around your house. The recycling bin is a great place to find a container that you can cut a slit in. And as I said, pieces of paper work just fine as something to translate into your hand. And it works on kind of defining these 2 muscle groups. So these are our precision fingers. These 2 and our thumb, those do a lot of our precision things. And these are our power side. So they do a lot of the stabilizing. So when we do things like hammering, it's a lot easier to hammer with holding these 2 fingers than trying to hammer like this without those 2 fingers. So these are our power fingers. These are our precision. And one way to kind of make this a little bit more of an exciting activity is to play a game with it. A lot of times we'll have items on the table and we'll have a dice or maybe a deck of cards that you have taken out, like the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, the 4s, those sorts of things. And then the first person will roll the dice, and if they get a number 4, they have to pick up 4 items and then put them into the container without dropping. and then the next person would roll the dice or draw a card. And that's something else that you can work on fine motor-wise, is that cupping motion and rolling dice, or isolating a card and being able to pick one up at a time. So that incorporates both translation as well as some other hand skills, a little bit more entertaining for your student, especially if you drop things like I do occasionally, so that they can call you out and remind you of what you need to do, or have them say, hey, am I doing something wrong? And let them be the ones to say, well, you aren't using your fourth finger, you're only trying to use your pinky. Or see if you can turn your hand over. Students love to be able to correct adults or call them out on a mistake they've made. So those are a couple of ways to practice this important hand skill that your students are likely going to use throughout the rest of their lives in some form or another.